Hello, bonjour, and ahoy. Yesterday evening, the 2025 GlobeSec Award ceremony and gala dinner were held at Prague Castle, where European Commissioner for Defense and Industry and Space Andrius Kubilius and National Security Advisor and Ambassador Thomas Poyar received the GlobeSec Award. And these are the highlights from day 2. The day started with remarks from Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky, who fervently declared that the European Coalition of the Willing is a clear demonstration of European resolve to continue exerting pressure on Russia. Still on the Havel stage, a dynamo of voices, including Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister Andrei Sybiha, pointed out the necessity of the U.S. engagement in the achievement of a ceasefire, however expressed skepticism that lasting peace is in sight given that Russia is not putting in a serious diplomatic effort. Against the backdrop of a global interconnected security system, voices from Europe and Asia discussed the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan as testbeds for expansionism of contesting powers, with Taiwan potentially bearing even more risk of a global conflict. A fiery exchange outlined a balancing act between EU membership ambitions and not cutting deeply felt ties with Russia, which mixes up a lot of emotions in the accession process. In partnership with the Baryon Investment Fund and the DEUCE project, a discussion during the side event focused on unlocking financing for defense and security industrial capabilities. Speakers explored the role of the Savings and Investments Union, EIB initiatives, and broader funding opportunities in the defense sector. Discussions highlighted key challenges including fragmented capital markets and regulatory, social, and economic barriers to increased investment. The GILF cohort dove into the crossroads of AI, economics, environment, and resilience, interconnecting forces shaping our reality in the midst of uncertainty and rising tensions. The lingering question of a European defense union was revisited against the backdrop of the GlobeSec report launch, A Stronger Europe, Building Defense for Uncertain Times, followed by a panel that once again highlighted the urgency of quick delivery of capabilities above the protracted deliberations on where they come from and how they're financed. Never far from attention, an opinion-expanding chat featuring Armenian Prime Minister Nikolai Pashinyan about his nation's role in a shifting world charted a determined course towards normalizing relations with Azerbaijan to contribute to sustainable stability in the Caucasus. A panel of senior supporters of Ukraine, including Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Chatnaka, framed the increasing of defense spending as an investment into the larger context of security guarantees for Ukraine given the interconnectedness of security in Europe. Given the overnight developments between Israel and Iran, GlobeSec organized a rapid response panel to discuss the potential escalation ladder and fallout for global security. The updates and big news doesn't stop coming, but we're not done yet. See you on day 3.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Latika Burke.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Havel stage for day 3, the final day of GlobeSec 2025. I love Roger's wrap-up videos because it makes me realise how many sessions I'm going to have to watch back on YouTube because I missed so many running around to all of them. There's just so much on. And that continues today. We hope you had a great night last night at the cocktail party at Zoffen Palace. We have all 3 main stages going again today. Here, of course, at Havel, we have the Schwarzenberg stage and up on the mezzanine level, the Albright stage. Here today we'll be looking at some really interesting topics: AI and its effect on news journalism, collective defence in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, that's my panel, so please do come, and the fight to return Ukraine's stolen children. And of course we still have all the side events that are taking place across the hotel, so try and get to as many as you can in the last few hours. I think you may have seen the great videos that are being broadcast around celebrating GlobeSec's 20th anniversary. So you can see that a lot of participants are wishing GlobeSec happy birthday. You can actually contribute and do your own. And all you have to do is scan the QR and then record your own happy birthday or happy anniversary message to GlobeSec. So please do that. We'll be finishing up here on the stage at 12:50, so please come back then for the wrap-up, and then we'll have lunch straight after. Now, this morning's topic gets straight into it. We'll be having a great panel discussing a very provocative topic, multilateralism 2.0. Should we fix it or forget it? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Laurence Norman.
Good morning, and thanks a lot for being here and coming to this panel on multilateralism. My name is Laurence Norman, and I'm a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, based out of Brussels and Berlin, and I cover foreign policy and security policy. So let me paint a picture for you. We have a gridlocked UN Security Council. We have great power competition. We have surging nationalism, collapse of arms control agreement, a hobbled WTO and ICC, US budget cuts and withdrawal from UN agencies, and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Multilateralism today is facing unprecedented challenges, ideological and against its institutions. And if you were among those who were pretty sanguine about the future of a peaceful rules-based order on Thursday morning when you arrived at GlobeSec, you might be just a little bit more anxious now that we have a full-out conflict between a nuclear Israel and a near-nuclear Iran. So what's to be done? Can any of the multilateral system be salvaged, and if so, how? Can we accept to live in a plurilateral world where groups of countries work together for specific goals and specific values? As the US withdraws, should we look to China to lead our multilateral institutions? And what kind of world would that be? To discuss all of this and to tell me why I'm wrong and just another polemical journalist, we have an excellent panel. We have Carlos Augusto Chacón, the director of the Institute of Political Science, Hernán Echavarría Olózaga in Colombia. We have Comfort Ero, president, CEO of the International Crisis Group. And we have Leslie Vinjamuri, Director, US and the Americas Program of Chatham House. And can I remind you, we love your questions. Please ask them. You can ask them on the Slido as well. But we'd like questions and not statements, and I will be ruthless in applying that rule. Thanks a lot. So, Carlos, can we start with you? How bad is the situation? How bad is how damaged is multilateral institutions? And does it matter?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a problem, Laurence, because people perceive the multilateralism with a lack of legitimacy, effectiveness, and transparency. So we need to recognize that many political actors today perceive that the multilateralism degenerate in what Tocqueville called like an administrative despotism, central planning supranational organizations that imposed agendas that don't respond effectively to today's challenges. For example, in Latin America, we need a multilateralism to help us to tackle the threats, the asymmetric and hybrid threats, the penetration and interference of authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, and Iran, the expansion of the transnational organized crime networks and the illicit networks that tackle the democracy, that put in risk the life of the people in countries like Colombia or Ecuador or Mexico, Brazil. So the issue is that many people and many political actors perceive that multilateralism is not more the way to cooperate to defend the freedom, the peace, the security, and the order. It's more like a bureaucratic organization that think that the world is better if we concentrate our efforts in other agendas, but not prioritizing the real threats. So if you want to fix something, you need to recognize the problems. So the next step, I think, is try to define the purpose of multilateralism. We need a multilateralism to be the platform to cooperation, coordination for response of many of these threats, especially in times of uncertainty and chaos provoking by the authoritarian regimes that they try to change the rule-based order inside the multilateral institutions, not outside. And for the other way, the strongest criminal organizations that cooperate with these regimes.
Comfort, do you agree with that? Has multilateralism just become a bureaucratic organization that that doesn't really face the threats of the world?
Well, it depends on where you sit. I mean, it's very easy also to condemn the idea of multilateralism, especially when we go back to the description that you painted at the start of the introduction from the session as well. And also every decade or two, we look at multilateralism. It's on a life support. It's on a coma. It's about to be buried, simply because of one simple reality. Multilateralism, in the end, is intergovernmental. States shape and design what they want from a multilateral system. If you look back since the founding, for example, of the pivotal multilateral body, the United Nations, you are left with the impression today that it's on the verge of collapse. Because simply what is different today is that one of the founding fathers of the United Nations, the United States specifically, unlike previous leaders, this is a United Nations administration that appears to want to break everything up as well. That is the difference today. But it was already in crisis before this current administration came into power. You've got disruptors, you've got people who usurp the essence of the charter. You've got leaders who come, shred the charter on the podium of the General Assembly. But you know what gives me hope? None of them have walked away from it. They still come and use it. They want to bend it to its will. They want to shape it to do its own bidding. When they find it useful, they'll come and use the Security Council to pursue a particular agenda. When they don't like it, they will sidestep the United Nations and go elsewhere, and then define various kind of other processes as well. There is nothing wrong, by the way, with plurilateral approaches, because we've always had coalitions of the willing, we've always had ad hoc systems, because oftentimes it's easier to work and quickly get alliances. That doesn't undermine the essence of multilateralism. Sometimes it props it up as well. But simply to say that this time it's very different because there is an active agenda to break it down and to destroy it. That is the difference. But the idea that you want to bend it to your will, that you want to get it to perform according to your own, this is not new. We've seen this before. And I can point to different decades where we've always asked ourselves, is multilateralism on the verge of something? Rwanda, Vietnam, the Arab Spring, all different. But this time, you've got disruptors, you've got people who want to break it up as well. That is the difference today. Whether they get their way is another thing.
Leslie, what are we really talking about here? I mean, can you break it down? What is a realistic multilateral system for the world look like today? What is it composed of? What are we talking about here?
I mean, first of all, I agree very deeply with what Comfort said and what we've heard across the two contributors so far. That we are both at a moment of kind of almost radical demolition to the an attempted demolition to the multilateral order, at least rhetorically, but also financially, right? It takes a lot of money to sustain the multilateral institutions especially the big ones. And I was in Geneva just the day before yesterday, speaking with somebody who runs one of the major multilaterals about the amount of money that's been taken out of their budget. And we know the stories across many of the multilaterals, and the threat that the U.S. will take even more is, and that means people are leaving and things aren't being continued, and potentially that China's sort of also moving into that space. But it is potentially a big kind of wrecking moment in terms of what we need. There are multiple reasons. Comfort's exactly right. The thing that's really new is that we have one of the key architects kind of using a sledgehammer, but what we've heard is also true, that there's been a problem for a very long time. And that part of it is because the world has changed, right? There are many critiques that are really valid. They're not all coming from the U.S. One is that the states that can really make a difference, that have the power, that have the connectivity, that are transforming on multiple dimensions, don't have the seat at the table that they need to have the legitimacy that they need to give them the voice and the influence that they need. That's not a new critique, but it's becoming more and more important, especially as the U.S. cedes the place. But I guess two others. One is that, the issues have changed, and the UN in particular has been very good, as have other, we've seen new multilateral organizations to kind of fill the gaps and innovate, but the issues are becoming really serious, and they're sort of a bit out of sync with the existing structures. And so there's always that question, do you adapt what you have, or do you start over? And I think so far we've gone for adaptation. That's certainly on the US side what President Biden was trying to do, but now we have an administration that's saying it doesn't work. Adaptation, incrementalism, it doesn't work. We're living in a radically different space, a deeply competitive space, certainly on questions of artificial intelligence, where the stakes are too high, and that sort of gets to the third critique, which again isn't new, but it's perhaps newly consequential. And that is that, multilateralism, the price you pay for collective legitimacy of decisions is slow, inefficient, bureaucratic, and in a world where technology is moving so fast and where the two very big powers are deeply competitive, they're not aligned, they don't have the same governance system domestically, although there's a question about the direction of travel in the US, but I think that in the medium term, we're still going to see a very different expectation of leaders and democracy and the role of that. And so we have two really strong countries competing in domains in which the level of development is so quick that the existing structures just look out of date. But I would close by saying that, my optimism comes from not the existing institutions and whether we turn to them or not, but the norm. And this really does get to your point, Comfort, that there's an expectation that you work with others. And if you don't, you sort of make an excuse for why you didn't. So that expectation, going to the institution or at least explaining your absence, I think is, it's a sign that we're still living in a radically different period of international relations as compared to anything before the end of the Second World War.
Loads of great comments there. I'm interested. For the last, as you've all reflected, for the last 20 years, there's been the frustration with the lack of reform of the multilateral institutions. Lip service given to it by Western countries didn't deliver. There's that. But as you've also touched on, there is the ideological opposition now. The surge of nationalism, which is a little newer, I think.
Is it?
So, Comfort, challenge that.
Is it? It was there in the First World War, before and the aftermath. It was there in the end of the Second World War. Populism, nationalism. These aren't new. I guess what is different today, big power rivalry is also not new. I think what worries me today is that they're all colliding at the same time. You've got the return of interstate conflict. You've got, internationalized civil wars, you've got regional civil wars, you've got artificial intelligence, you've got really rapid pace technology that you're talking about, and whether the institutions themselves can catch up to these new realities, I think is the challenge. Not just for institutions, it's governments themselves. I mean, everything is happening at a fast pace that you're having to catch up as well. But all these isms are not new. I think the biggest challenge is not the institutions, but the leaders that shape these institutions, which is why I said that the architects, the P5, if you want, themselves, are all in some kind of crisis, both domestically, and some of them have a very different vision of what the founding fathers wanted for these institutions. This, for me, is the real challenge as well. And then in every region that you look at, where you've got a regional body, you've got the African Union, you've got the OAS, you've got ASEAN. These institutions themselves all suffer from one thing, i.e. the absence of a leader who cares enough about these institutions to continue to shape them into the future. This is the challenge of the time. The institutions are what they are, but they are shaped by the leaders who care enough about those institutions as well. So I think we've got to make sure that we are actually looking at those who are trying to govern them, and what are they governing them for, and what do they want out of these institutions as well.
I'd like to break this down and ask each of you to give me 2 or 3 pointers, 2 or 3 things that you think can change and should change to make the multilateral system stronger. Just a 2 or 3 and a brief explanation why, Carlos.
First one, the transparency, more oversight by the parliaments in the National Congress, for example. It's a lack of transparency, for example, in budget issues about the finance of the multilateral institutions. The second one, more result-oriented in order to define priorities in the multilateral action and cooperation. People perceive that these organizations have been transforming in a kind of institution to regulate everything, over-regulate everything. Right now in Europe, as we can see these days of the forum, many of the representatives of the country said the innovation, for example, have a lot of barriers, product of a lot of regulations. So we need no more regulation. We need that the multilateral system become a platform for cooperation to solve problems. So more results-oriented actions. And the third is, I think, we need to develop capabilities to respond to the today threats, to the current threats, asymmetric threats, hybrid threats, the interference of the authoritarian regimes in Latin America. For example, we need more cooperation with the European Union to, in terms of intelligence, in illicit finance, in cooperation in the judicial system, develop capabilities in terms of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and also in technologies to tackle the criminal network. So I think it's prioritize the actions for the multilateral.
Leslie, can I come around to you and then come back to Comfort?
Yeah.
What's your list?
I mean, I guess a couple of things. One is there's clearly a messaging problem, right? That there needs to be more communication by those who are committed as to, A, what is being done, because there's just an absence of knowledge. Amongst the broader informed and engaged public even, about what states are doing, what the successes have been, and not a long list, a couple of things, and clearly communicated by those who are on the side of multilateralism, because I'm about to go to an organization, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, that has been doing systematic polling on American attitudes towards various international issues since 1974. And if you actually look, Americans want to be internationally engaged. They support NATO. They support a number of what we might call multilateral initiatives that there is a base of support there, but what I think America, and I'll speak to the U.S. because it's one of the countries, it's probably the country I know the best, and I am American. What Americans don't really know is what are Europeans doing? What does the rest of the world do? They just have an absence of knowledge about what Africa is doing, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific concretely to deliver and contribute to multilateral successes, small or big, but that are consequential. And so I think there is a real communication problem, a real messaging problem. And one of the things that I'm trying to encourage my friends in, and I'm going to be doing a lot more of it in the weeks and months and years ahead, please come to Chicago and the rest of the United States and tell us what you're doing so that Donald Trump can't say they're free riding, they're not doing anything, the rest of the world is just, riding our coattails, because it's not actually true. We all know it's not true. We all know that it has taken many states and non-state actors to contribute to the successes that we've seen on peace and development, on humanitarianism and human rights, on development generally, but I don't think actually that most Americans know. So if you want to get the U.S. back into the game, you've got to have a messaging campaign that's directed at the public diplomacy, and it's got to be concrete and strategic, not just like kind of grab bag. And I guess the second thing is much harder, which is that, it is a little bit like, okay, so, let's do multilateralism. Iran and Israel, Gaza, Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't look like a great success. So how do you get real about the failures while not kind of dampening any aspiration or undermining what's there? And I don't know on this one whether it's that you limit the stated objective and you say, look, okay, at the level of peace and stability at the highest levels, this is not where multilaterals are really able to make the difference right now, unless it's just sort of a convening space once a year at UNGA. And I think that actually is important to kind of show us where the world is. But it might be saying, but minilaterals link up with multilaterals, and they derive their legitimacy from the same principle, which is that we've got to consult, we can't do it alone, and we only really can operate if we have a generalized principle of more than 2 or 3 states working together to solve a problem. So I think, there are real problems, but there is also, a really big messaging problem.
Confirm.
Leslie, I come from a country that exited from a multilateral body, and well, the UK.
I don't remember
from
that.
the EU.
I'm kidding.
Oh, unless you don't think the EU.
I'm kidding.
Unless you don't think.
I covered it, so I remember it.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me from the mic, because I don't know if there's a problem with the microphone.
Can you use the mic? Yeah.
Is this better? Yeah. So as you were talking about the messaging, it's also when you live in the age of disinformation and misinformation about about the fact that multilateralism is so far removed from your day-to-day reality. You don't quite understand how it benefits your day-to-day bread and butter living, how it deals with the fact that you're not working, you don't have a good job, the state is so far removed from you. So the messaging and the communications is real, and I think that partly explains why there was the Brexit agenda that played out in the UK as well. I mean, look, if there's an essay that every single undergraduate still answers at school today, that if the UN didn't exist, if multilateralism, would you create it? And the answer still, you might know better than me, Leslie, is yes, we would still have the system, what it would look like, how it will change. But nonetheless, everybody walks out of that room saying yes, but yes, and yes, maybe I'll do it this way as well. So I think that answer, let's square it away. The question is what would you add on and make it look better? What I think is a biggest disappointment today is that the Security Council has abdicated from its prime role of being the arbiter of international peace and security. However, what did we see yesterday? Iran was making a case for why what Israel did was an aberration, was wrong. Israel too, despite its own position, was also there. The United States too. So as I said, they all turn up at the chamber of the Security Council because they see it as a legitimate platform in which to air their positions and their grievance as well. So it shows you that it still matters, but the Security Council is so highly dysfunctional because it reflects the geopolitical realities that we see as well. The other issue is that when the United Nations, whether it's in the form of its agency, its leader, the Secretary General, whether it's in the form of key departments, marginalizes itself from places where it ought to be and hides behind humanitarianism, then I think it also undermines the power that the agency has at the end of the day. So don't reduce everything to humanitarianism when in fact humanitarianism is highly political as well. And let's stop talking about the reform of the Security Council and let's just get on with it. Anyway, these countries are going to vote with their feet. Because in the end, as you were talking about the table, who are we looking at today to help with the survival of the United Nations? We are turning to middle powers. In the end, the Black Sea grain deal, for example, had to be delivered with the support of Turkey.
Yeah.
In the end, the conversation around the future survival of these agencies depends on the Brazils, depends on the Colombias, depends on the India. So let's just get on with the task of really stop paying lip service to reform and just get on with what it begins to look like as well, and bring it to the people, which is essentially what you're talking about. By the way, in every single region that we're in, there are multilateral institutions. So if your starting point is the UN, then you're going to look at it very bleakly. If your starting point, however, are the various regional bodies, there is a story to be told about multilateralism in key regions around the world. Whether it's working or not, it's a reflection of the United States, the United Nations, and maybe the United States as well. Yeah, but let's stop talking about reform. Let's just get on with it. Because people will vote with their feet and just do it themselves. And let's also focus on making sure we bring it to the people, because in the end, that's what matters at the end of the day.
Oh, I want to take a question from the audience. For Carlos, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, in the case of the Western Hemisphere, we have the OAS, the Organization of American States. But in Latin America, for example, we have the Maduro's regime, Cuba's regime, Nicaragua regime. We live in the neighborhood with 3 dictatorships. And many of our countries have problems in their democracy: Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador. For example, the charter for the Inter-American Democratic Charter is supposed to serve as an instrument to make pressure to restore the democracy and the respect of human rights in the region, but Maduro's continue oppressing the opposition. You know, the people in Latin America perceive that these kind of organizations didn't work because they are part of the problem. You know, so this is the kind of debates that we need to talk about multilateralism, is about the effectiveness and legitimacy, because they didn't work enough to contribute to build a better world in our countries. So I think it's part of the problem that we try to, you know, make this a conversation about, yeah, it's imperfect, but it's better, it's worse if we don't have it. I think we need to transform it, or at the end of the day, change the kind of multilateralism that we built.
Actually, you know, as you were talking, in West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States has just seen 3 of its members leave it. Whether they'll go for final divorce is what we don't know. So they've created these are the 3 Sahelian countries: Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And it wasn't just an anti-French instinct; it was also a telling off to the region that your regional body, the architect of peace and security on the African continent, is no longer viable to address the needs that we want as the Sahelian countries. And this week, Rwanda pulled away from its own regional body in annoyance that it was it wasn't allowed to take up the presidency because of its tussle with the Democratic Republic of Congo. But they haven't left the African Union, but they've left the regional bodies as well. So there is something happening in the regions, but they've all gone off to design their own multilateralism. The question is whether the new alliance for the Sahel will survive as a regional body. It's trying to invite others into. So you've raised an interesting point
and to come back to you, the point you've made a couple of times, Comfort, that people are very frustrated the system doesn't work, but people don't walk away. Burkina Faso was in the IAEA voting with Russia and China against the Iran resolution.
Yeah.
They don't walk away.
They don't walk away. They, as I said, they use it in a way that suits their own agendas as well. They want to bend it to its will. They will be disruptors in these bodies as well. But sometimes they do walk away, but they walk away from the ones that are specific to their regions. But I haven't seen anybody necessarily walk away from the United Nations. Maybe they will. Who knows?
I've got a couple of excellent skeptical questions on Slido. Is there anyone in the audience? Gentleman over there, can you wait for the microphone to be delivered to you? Thank you.
Hi there, Kurt Bessiner from Democratization Policy Council based in Sarajevo. I have a concrete question. We have 3 summits back-to-back coming. We got G7 coming up, then we've got the EU-Canada summit, and then we've got NATO, all in the next 2 weeks. What can the panel reflect on the potential of the remaining transatlantic liberal democracies to try to be the backbone of residual multilateralism? You see the conflict between 4 of the 5 Eyes and the United States over sanctioning Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I'm just curious how you see the potential of that, or whether that's going to be high-powered enough to work.
Leslie, do you want to take that?
You want me to go?
Well, it's your turn.
Okay. Let me answer that and also add one comment to the previous. And I guess when I was listening to Comfort, I was thinking it's also that when you talk about kind of putting your name, whether it's on a communique at the end of one of these summits or whether it's, on a resolution, where do you come out? It's also important because it gives those who are not inside the institutions the ability to hold to account what is, it would be very nice for the country that we live in, the United Kingdom, not to have to always say where it stands in the context of a US that's often going against resolutions that perhaps the UK would prefer it didn't. But it's good that it does have to take a position for the rest of the world, because it can say, it can hold, the elected leaders to account domestically. The bigger concern, I think, is internationally. That's where people are watching, that you actually have to say where you stand. That's a very powerful thing. It's not just about the states. In terms of these, and I guess in terms of these 3 summits, it's a fascinating time for those of us working on these issues. This is where I get a little bit more, it's not about the final agreement. It really is about the process. At this point, given, the multiple wars, the high-stake challenges domestically, it's just good if we can get through and get everybody in the room moving towards conversation. I would put the bar actually very, very low, and I would see it as quite high. If we can get through these 3 summits with a level of engagement on what the critical issues are and trying to move forward, that's deeply unsatisfying. On the G7, there was, I thought, a very persuasive article published in Foreign Affairs a few days ago saying the way for the G7 by John Eikenberry and Victor Chon and one other, I think John Hemery, saying the way for the G7 to be effective is to include, to really take seriously the fact that you need to have Japan, South Korea, and was it Australia maybe? Very engaged for the G7 because of where the locus of many of the issues. So starting to think about engagement, reform through engagement is critical. Obviously, it would be good if there could be a slight more movement on the wars. But I think that at this point, having a low bar is probably a good idea, because the worst thing would be to have a repeat of, G7 and Trump 1.0. We don't need that right now. Especially right now, we don't need that. So I would keep the bar quite low.
Do you want, go on.
Well, so to go back, because you raised the messaging and the communication thing, the one thing you don't want is Trump going in there saying, you failed. Actually, the one thing they could say is that, Mr. President, we heard you. You were right about the burden shifting, the burden sharing, and we've raised in various means the percentage issue. This would be specific to NATO. So let's just kill that conversation in the way that you articulated earlier as well. The other issue is, in the end, I actually take Trump seriously when he says that he doesn't want to see any more wars. I think there is some truth in the questioning of US foreign adventurism overseas. And I think he's right about that. But of course, there is the inconsistency and the incoherence, and then the miscalculations, and then you find yourselves dragged into a war by accident as well, or by the choices that you make as well. So I think that's, in the end, that's what people are going to be worried about, not the actual summit itself, but how we actually make sure that in the end, that there is a clear path to negotiation for Russia's invasion into Ukraine. There is an answer to the devastation in Gaza, and that there is a response to what could be a devastating regional war between Iran and Israel. If in the end, this is the issue, if you can't address those issues, then people will continue to question the summitry. People will begin to question what is the purpose of these institutions. And just one more last thing, because as I remember, it was only 3 or 4 years ago that one of the key countries who decided to come back into NATO turned around and said, NATO's brain dead. Well, here we are today, and NATO's become quite instrumental in a number of things that we're thinking about. So, but the summits are only useful if they begin to put some serious skin in the game in terms of how you bring these conflicts to an end as well. And in the end, that's what matters, because it's quite a devastating era that we're living in, with wars rising and just human suffering on a scale that we haven't seen since Rwanda and the end of the Second World War.
I'm going to take a next question. The lady in green towards the back, or the middle.
Thank you. Good morning for this intriguing discussion. Galina Neos, former NATO, now co-founder of the Brussels Freedom Hub. Two very brief questions. How would you think the reform of the UN Security Council could be achieved? So what could be the concrete steps there towards that goal? Second question, you mentioned that intergovernmentalism or multilateralism is largely intergovernmental. Do we not need to start thinking that it should also be non-governmental and reconceptualize multilateralism? Thank you.
Carlos, take the nice, easy question on the UN Security Council.
No, I think it's quite difficult. At the end of the day, you need the Security Council, and that the reflection of the reality of the world. You have allies and you have enemies or rivals, systemic rivals. So it's quite difficult. That's why, for example, George Kennan said that it's better if you use a particularistic approach in order to maintain the security and the order in the world, more than the universalistic approach that you try to talk with everybody and try to put in the same way in according different actors. So, but today, if we don't have the Security Council, what we have? What is the option? What is the contrafactual about this kind of organization? This is a necessity that they perceive, but also at the same time we change and use another strategies to resolve the problem. So cross-regional cooperation, new alliances based on values and interests are more important than maintain only the Security Council or the UN traditional organization. So it's quite difficult, but we need to adapt and recognize the system that we live today.
Cover, since you were like, let's reform it, let's do it. Pick up the UN Security Council, and then maybe you can, Leslie, pick up the world without countries, multilateralism without countries question.
Yeah, the whole issue of the Security Council, oh my God, we're doing that again, came back onto the table last year because President Biden put it on the table. You know, nobody can take reform seriously if the most important players themselves do not sort of give some indication that they're open to it. And not only did Biden administration sort of give a nod to it, but they even went as far as to say which countries which I think is a problem as well. I think you've got to leave the regions to decide which countries. For example, let me talk about, well, there'll be a tussle between Brazil and Mexico and Argentina for sure, in terms of who represents the region in the Security Council. I come to Africa, 54 countries. We have a very clear idea of who the superpowers are on the continent, but can you imagine Nigeria and South Africa, who's going to win that fight as well? And the African Union does have a process for which to select who represents the continent at the council, and they're making the case, because there are 54 countries, they're making the case that they should have 2 on the continent as well. And then you come to Asia, and then you've got, of course, you've got the tussle with India and Pakistan. There'll be a view there. Japan, the size of your pocket should be what indicates whether you go on the table. China will surely have a view in there. So when you look at it, yes, in principle, let's say yes to Security Council, and then you get down into the politics of which one in the region, and then we're never going to get there. By the way, in Europe, Germany feels that it should sit at the table, but then the rest of Europe will be at the table. I would say that if our starting point is the United Nations, we're going to get stuck and just go round and round in circular arguments. There is multilateralism and different kinds of fora. So we've got the IFIs. I would actually, the international financial institutions, I would actually say that if you really want to see change, this is where I would go to first. Because it's a matter of cash. It's a matter of money. And these are the institutions, at the end of the day, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, that I think there's a real debate about development and how these agencies are performing in the various regions. And there is a viable conversation, an interesting conversation going on in the IFIs about what reform could look like. And I think that's where I would have more, not necessarily more promise, but I think more practical conversations about how you reform development and funding going forward in various places, given what's happened with USAID.
There's multilateralism with that.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on Cumbert's comments as well, which I completely agree with, and you make a very powerful and highly pragmatic point, and I'm sure it's the right one. But I would also, from my perspective, add that I think legitimacy is just critical. And to multilateralism, it's conferred, the UN Security Council has the gift of giving it when it comes to matters of peace and stability. And I just don't think that we can give up on the game of reform. I think it's got to be changed. I think it's completely illegitimate, increasingly so, for multiple reasons. And it can't, it's true. It's not going to happen. It's packed with politics. But we should set it as the requirement and ideal that it needs to be reformed. You can't not. I mean, India and Pakistan, sure, but India is the 4th largest economy now. 4th largest economy. Nuclear power. I mean, this is, it's India, Pakistan isn't really the question. It's India versus a number of other larger powers. So I wouldn't even go region by region, although I accept that. And there are all these debates, but it has to be reformed. It's actually no longer representative of the distribution of power in the international order. And that's what it's there to do. So I think it has to be reformed. On the question of non-state actors, absolutely. When we look at a number of the issues, we know, and the people who are deeply expert in working on these issues, whether it's climate or artificial intelligence, the governance, regulation, the hope for that, financing, that there has to be multiple stakeholders around the table, that private firms, especially in the technology space, are often setting the standards or rejecting the standards, but driving the conversation. The game in climate finance is very much, about getting the private world, the philanthropic world as well engaged. But governments are critical to that, right? Governments ultimately have to make the decisions, set the standards, or refuse to set the standards. So I think it's that multiplicity of stakeholders around the table that and we like to think that not-for-profits are critical as well, but frequently it's just to convene those very diverse set of actors and to help drive some sort of consensus, or at least not consensus is kind of wrong because there's never a consensus, but there's at least a brokered solution that can hold for a period of time until you get a better brokered solution. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of where a lot of the game is.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes. I want to take one more question from the audience, but I also want to throw you a question. What about China? What is its promise to the multilateral system, and what is its threat? So I'm going to put that out there and then take one more question. You've got a minute and a half for this, yeah?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll come to China. I'm Lobsang Sangye. I'm from Harvard Law School. Security Council is here to stay. But if you're a victim of P5, or if you're protected by P5, Israel and Iran, nothing is going to happen. And Tibetans, I'm Tibetan, Uyghurs and Hong Kongs, nothing is going to happen. Now you say then we should go to regional side, right? Uyghurs, mosques are destroyed. But for Arab countries, they don't vote for the Uyghurs, right? So regional aspect is also nothing's going to happen. So even if you expand the Security Council, even if you expand the council, if there's a veto power, if you're a victim of the P5 or Security Council, nothing's going to happen. Okay. How do you reform that?
Take that, guys. Carlos, do you want to start? Very brief.
About China, I think China used the soft power and the sharp power to take control of the multilateral institutions, and right now they instrumentalize this institution to their own objectives, and it's a risk for the democracy and the security around the world. It's an issue. You can see, for example, in the UN Agency for Health, they blocked Taiwan to advertise the rest of the world about the COVID-19. So it's the kind of action that China developed in the multilateral system.
Comfort, and then.
I do agree with reform of the Security Council. I'm not even questioning it. But you've just put your finger on the core that will also destroy the attempt to reform, which is the veto. What binds the P5? They will rally behind the veto. They're not going to give that up for anything, and that I think is the real challenge and makes reform very difficult to get with. I will just say one more thing. China has been a beneficiary of the security of the United Nations, so has Russia as well. It doesn't want to necessarily give it up, but again, it wants to bend it to its will and to do what it wants it to do, and it will continue to do that, as will the P5, all the P5 countries as well.
Leslie, you're going to have to come back next
30
year.
seconds.
Go on.
The resolution to the question of China, if you see it as a problem that China's trying to embed its norms, which are sometimes, some people would argue often, illiberal in the UN system, the solution is to keep the US in a productive way, and to keep Europe in, and to keep the major liberal democracies in, not to push China out. It's to make sure that the distribution of normative power leans towards the values that we most care about and that were foundational to the United Nations.
Brilliant ending, brilliant panel. Thank you very, very much. So a round of applause, everyone, for the panel. And our next session, if you folks, I think you can exit the stage. And our next session, but no one else can. Our next session here is called "The Fight to Return Ukraine's Stolen Children," and we'll be interviewing Daria Zarivka, advisor to the head of office of the President of Ukraine and Chief Operating Officer. Bring Kids Back organization. So please don't move, we'll be straight back. Thanks a lot.